So,
Thanks.
everyone, let me introduce Dr. Emma Gordon, who's another one of our colleagues at Glasgow, and she's going to be talking to us on augmented reality and intellectual enhancement. Take it away, Emma. Thank you.
Okay, hi, thanks to Fiona and Laura for inviting me. I want to start off with a bit of background to help you understand how I'm going to try to connect kind of unrelated on the face of it area of research to AR. So today I'm going to be thinking about AR as a kind of cognitive enhancement or intellectual enhancement. And the reason that I'm approaching it from this direction is because most of the time now I work in bioethics and in particular on questions about improving our function cognitively, morally and emotionally through new and emerging drugs and technologies. So what I want to do is try and think about AR in connection with enhancement in a way that I hope will be of some interest epistemologically, because cognitive enhancement is one way of more expediently gaining true beliefs, knowledge, understanding, and other epistemic goods. So as a little bit of background, bioconservative philosophers or bioethicists are a group of people who think that cognitive enhancement is, for various reasons, something that we should avoid. So they offer a whole range of different kinds of philosophical arguments against it, even though it seems like it would be good for us epistemically speaking, again, because of gaining more true beliefs, knowledge, etc. Two particular arguments I'm going to be interested in today are around, first of all, the value of achievements, and secondly, authenticity. So this first worry suggests that when we're cognitively enhanced, at least in some circumstances, we have less valuable successes or achievements as a result. And the authenticity objection suggests that in some way we're less authentic when we are cognitively enhanced. And what I want to do is think about these arguments with respect to AR specifically. In this debate in general, these arguments tend to target pharmacological cognitive enhancements, or what you might think of as smart drugs. And as far as I know, nobody has yet tried to think about reframing these arguments around questions about augmented reality. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to think with all of you about whether either of these kinds of worries about achievement and authenticity, respectively, would have any kind of teeth against AR as a form of cognitive enhancement. Here is the plan for what I want to do. First of all, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the ideas that are relevant in the human enhancement debates, just so that you know what I'm talking about. Then I want to outline these two arguments about cheapened achievements and authenticity in the way that they're normally framed. So that's with respect to pharmacological enhancements. Then what I want to do is try and be as charitable as possible about how we could take these arguments and create versions of them that target AR as a cognitive enhancement specifically. And I want to suggest through some criticisms of those attempted reconstructions that these types of worries don't really work as objections to AR, although some of you might disagree. And then what I'll do is I'll wrap up with a couple of remarks about what I think this means for the prospects of enhancing ourselves through AR, which I think are some positive conclusions about AR as compared to using pharmacological cognitive enhancements. So when we talk about enhancement in bioethics, what we tend to be talking about is roughly these different ways of making ourselves better than well in slogan form. This might be physically through something like doping in sports, or cognitively, morally, emotionally. The key thought is that we're moving ourselves sort of above the baseline, where a treatment or a therapy would be something that would bring our health back up to a sort of baseline, and then an enhancement would be something that would take us past that into this kind of better than well area. Kind of classic cases that are of relevance in this debate include the US Air Force's use of modafinil in pilots to help them fly their planes more safely for longer on less sleep, steroids for strength, and also more speculatively, there's kind of work on how we might use certain psychedelic interventions to help boost people's empathy when they're in sort of conflict-based relationship issues, for example. So these are some of the cases that people tend to be interested in when they're thinking about enhancement. And the contentious nature of enhancement interfaces with a whole lot of different philosophical topics. Some people are worried about the potential for inequality, where richer, more privileged people get hold of enhancements more readily than those who are already disadvantaged and thereby become more advantaged. Other people are worried about what enhancement might do to our agency or whether it really boosts our well-being. And there are questions even about human nature and whether it's in some sense unnatural to modify ourselves through certain drugs and technologies. And for people who are worried about cognitive and other forms of enhancement, they're not just worried about sort of any science and medicine that could boost functioning. So that's an important kind of caveat here. So on the one hand, these kind of bioconservative philosophers don't seem to care that much about high-tech therapies. So, you know, things like using robotic heart valve replacements or effective laser eye surgery. And they also don't really seem to care that much about mundane uses of enhancement. So things like coffee or education or wearing a watch or these sorts of cases. In general, bioconservatives are interested in new and sometimes merely possible uses of science and medicine rather than these more kind of traditional cases of enhancement or these fancy cases that are in the treatment category rather than enhancement category. And what, again, just to kind of summarize there is of interest then is firstly things that are not just therapeutic, so they're not meant to just treat pathologies, and again they're meant to be at least sort of forward looking, so modern interventions of some sort or imagined future interventions. In the cognitive case, I've already given you the example of using drugs like modafinil or Ritalin, so narcolepsy and ADHD treatments that maybe give us just a little bit of a boost cognitively if we're not suffering from either of those issues. And also there are these kind of speculative sci-fi cases that are of interest too. So this is roughly what the people who are worried about enhancement tend to focus on when they offer philosophical considerations against it. There are again lots of different considerations that might constitute arguments against enhancement, and the two I'll be interested in today, the achievement worry and the authenticity worry, they represent just two of those concerns. And what I'll offer you is a kind of template characterization of both of these worries so that we can get them in view and then try to recast them as potential objections to AR-based enhancement. So I'll start off with the achievement-based worry and then the authenticity concern. At the heart of this worry that we might call the cheapened achievements objection is this thought that using pharmacological interventions to boost our cognitive function in some way makes our successes cheaper or less valuable. And underlying this is some sort of thought about difficulty or effort being removed or downgraded and sort of taking some of the value of an achievement with it. We can see this in various different guises across bioconservative literature. A really famous example is Leon Kass. He was George Bush's sort of chief bioethicist during his presidential run for whatever that is or isn't worth. And he was very strongly bioconservative during that time and still is, I think. And one of his big worries was that if we do things like use drugs to make our cognitive function better, we in some way sever this link between our performance and our effort. And so successes just become too easy or trivial to be meaningful or valuable in his view. So again, underneath there's some kind of thought that the value of achievement is at least partly in the difficulty or the effort of it. And so enhancement reduces that difficulty or effort by removing or kind of downgrading obstacles and thereby reduces the value of the achievement. We can also see kind of similar ideas outside of the bioethics literature, such as in Gwen Bradford's work on the nature of achievement. So she has no particular stake in the enhancement debate as far as I know, but she also commits to this idea that difficulty is very important in making a success valuable, specifically making it more valuable than, say, a lucky success or a success where somebody else helped you get your achievement. And I think Kass's idea implies something very similar to this view that Bradford has about the role that effort plays in making our achievements valuable. We also see something similar in Michael Sandel's work. He has this book, The Case Against Perfection, that goes through quite a lot of different considerations against enhancement, and how he characterizes it is in terms of sort of who deserves the credit. So he thinks that at least past a certain point, an enhanced subject no longer deserves the credit for their achievement, and instead we should give that credit to their pharmacist or to the drug company or whoever came up with or provided the person with the enhancement. And these enhancement aided successes, he thinks, then are less creditable to the person's ability than they are just to the existence of the drug or to its design. So again, we have something similar here, the thought that achievements and the value of achievement has a lot to do with the extent to which it's creditable to ability rather than to something else, like luck or somebody else's assistance. There's also something similar that you can see in Joe Feinberg's way of talking about credit and blame. So this core thought that an aim being attained through ability matters for the value of an achievement is kind of mirrored in his thought that the degree to which we deserve credit for particular outcomes has this sort of proportionate relationship to the extent to which the outcomes caused by our character or our abilities. Again, rather than something else. And so Sandel's claim that enhancement is undermining the value of achievements by divorcing performance from effort, I think gets some support not only from Bradford's work on achievement, but also from Feinberg's sort of view about thinking about the importance of ability in making achievements valuable. So that's a little bit about the cheapened achievements objection and how you might find support for it, not just in the enhancement debate, but in the work of people thinking about achievement more generally. And the key takeaways for our purposes, I think, are as follows. So firstly, we've got this thought that when we attain some intellectual aim through, in this particular case, drug-based enhancement, the extent to which it comes from our ability or our effort or our agency or however you want to frame it is diminished. And because exercise of ability and effort has an important role in the extent to which achievements are valuable, we then have these less valuable achievements from these cases of pharmacological enhancement. So that's the sort of worry at the very heart of the cheapened achievements objection. A different kind of philosophically oriented worry is about authenticity, which is a pretty tricky concept, one that you may or may not think is useful once I kind of unpack it a bit more. The way in which it's talked about, it tends to mean something like being true to oneself, and there's an underlying assumption here that it's sort of good to be true to yourself and not good to not be true to yourself, and that part of being of having a flourishing human life is being true to yourself. So if something makes you less true to yourself, that's sort of a prima facie consideration against it. And you might be able to kind of see why at least some people think that there's some sort of tension between authenticity as being true to yourself and using enhancements that alter our functioning in some way, so that change our dispositions or attitudes or faculties. So what we get then is this question of whether if we change ourselves or our faculties through cognitive enhancement drugs, say, might we not in some way make ourselves less authentic? And if so, isn't this a sort of serious downside of cognitive enhancement? Now, to get a bit of traction on what's going on with this kind of debate, it's helpful to think about how people in bioethics tend to think about what this authenticity concept refers to. So what is the true self? And when we think about some of the views that are offered there, we get a bit of a contrastive grip on what might count as authentic versus inauthentic. And that might help us then assess whether certain drug-based cases or later certain AR-based cases bring about some type of inauthenticity. Now, you might reject the idea that the notion of a true self is helpful. I think it can be quite woolly in a lot of these debates. But for today, what I'm going to do is grant that it refers to something that's useful and then show you a couple of not exhaustive ways to account for what the true self might be and how it's unpacked in this literature. So we've got these kind of diametrically opposed almost views of what the true self might consist in, which are typically called essentialism and existentialism. And what we have with the essentialist view is the thought of the true self as this kind of set of fixed characteristics that are inherent in you. So learning about your true self on an essentialist sort of view is a kind of excavation process or something like that, where you gradually discover what it is that is fixed and true at the heart of you. And if this is the sort of view that you're attracted to, then it's not too far a leap to think that cognitive enhancements, say, might make us less authentic because they're doing something to alter those parts of you that the essentialist thinks are these core fixed bits that make you your true self. So if you use enhancement drugs and things to adjust these capacities, it seems like maybe you're less authentic as a result. At the other end, you've got this existentialist view that suggests that what matters is instead sort of what you choose to become or how you choose to develop. So to manifest authentic choices, what you do is make choices that are in alignment with values that you'd endorse on critical reflection. And it's not so obvious that cognitive enhancements are problematic on an existentialist view, as long as they're in line with the kind of values that we'd endorse. So there's at least one reasonably popular view in this debate, the essentialist view, on which cognitive enhancement poses an issue. Now, I don't want to today try to adjudicate between these views or really talk much about the space in between, which actually might well be the more plausible space to capture what being true to yourself is meant to mean. But rather what I want to do is try and use these views as opposing ways to sort of assess the impact that enhancement might have on authenticity. So again, to sort of sum this up, the way that we summed up the cheapened achievements worry, there's an underlying idea here that all else equal, we should try to avoid being inauthentic, and that using drugs to change our faculties and our dispositions contributes to inauthenticity, at least on one view, and that so all things being equal, we should avoid cognitive enhancement drugs. So those are the two kind of worries that I want to focus on today and try and imagine with respect to AR. So this is now maybe the bit that's more of interest to people at this workshop. I'm going to set aside the issue of whether the two objections I discussed are good objections to drug-based enhancement. Personally, I'm not persuaded by either in most cases for reasons that, again, I'll set aside. And instead, what I'm interested in is whether any variation on these two worries could seem at least somewhat compelling when we think about cognitive enhancement through augmented reality. So I want to look at these two in turn and then evaluate them through a couple of thought experiments that I think help to clarify what these objections would look like if recast in the AR case. The first test case I want to think about is a case of a cardiologist. So I'll just tell you about these two cases and then we'll go through what they might mean after we've been through the cases. So firstly, we've got a kind of standard case of an operation that doesn't involve AR, where you have a cardiologist performing a heart valve operation, looking at the surrounding tissue, monitoring patients' vitals, looking at their medical details, which is involving sort of shifting attention from different bits of information and monitors. So they're synthesizing all this information through effort and attention to detail. And in this test case, suppose that the surgeon realizes that the patient's going to need further monitoring for the potential risk of some complication. For our purposes, it doesn't matter what that might be. The contrast case then, cardiologist 2 with AR, is one where we imagine that a cardiologist doing a heart valve replacement comes to the same conclusion, so that there's some potential risk here of a complication, but they make their assessment while just looking at the patient's heart and all the other relevant information. So the vitals, medical history, all of that stuff is digitally overlaid in their visual field during the operation. So there's this easier inference from that information to the conclusion that there is this risk of complication that the surgeon needs to look out for. So the first case, no AR, the second case, AR. The other kind of test case I think is relevant for thinking about these objections is the designer case. So this comes partly from, I was reading about how IKEA has this version of AR technology that they hope is going to help them sell more furniture. And this type of technology can be used by interior decorators and things to envisage what furniture and so on would look like in a person's home. So again, imagine here you've got two contrasting cases, two interior designers. They both have a bunch of furniture and they're asked by a client to propose how that furniture might be arranged. The first designer, designer A, uses their imagination and images of the different rooms in the client's house to try to picture what might go where and to kind of draw up a configuration for the client. Then the second designer uses AR to virtually play around with the arrangements. So they've got the same furniture in the same rooms, but they have this augmented reality way of visualizing it. And suppose, just to keep the cases consistent, that they both come up with the same idea of where the furniture should go. So these are the two sets of test cases I'm going to use to think about the two potential objections. The first is the case of the cardiologist, where one uses AR while operating and the other doesn't. And the second is the set of designer cases, where one uses AR to envision the placement of furniture and the other uses their imagination and images. So what we'll do now is think about how to try and recast the cheapened achievements worry and then move on to this authenticity concern. So if we take the cardiologist case again, if we try and apply the cheapened achievements worry about, the role of effort and difficulty in the value of achievements, it seems like someone like Sandel or Cass, who's sympathetic to that sort of worry, will try to tell us that the second surgeon, the AR surgeon, as it were, is making an inference that's less valuable. So their successful inference involves less ability or less effort than it does in the first case without AR. And so in some sense, the achievement is less valuable. Now, what should we think about that? First, we need to set aside the consideration about, the likelihood of survival and whether one case is better than the other for making it likely that the patient will make it through the surgery. What the proponent of the cheapened achievements objection is interested in is this kind of all else equal claim that the first sort of case without AR is significantly more valuable than the second because there's this reduced amount of effort or ability in the AR case. So this is, again, all else equal. And I think there's a couple of different replies we could try here, and maybe some of you might be able to think of a better reply or a way in which maybe these replies don't work as well as I might think. The first way I think we could reply is to say that even if things are easier in the AR surgery case, there's still more ability at play in the case than there is AR when it comes to explaining what accounts for the success. So to see what I mean here and what I think matters, suppose we take this case of the cardiologist using AR and split that into two subversions. So now we've got two surgeons or two people using AR to try to do surgery. One is an expert cardiologist and the other is an amateur. I think when we think about it this way, what is obvious is that the amateur isn't in the position to draw the inference about the risk of the complication in the heart surgery without the background expertise that the expert cardiologist has. So what I think that kind of contrast kind of helps to bring out is that the AR is making the inference more straightforward to draw, but that drawing is predicated on the cardiologist having the relevant expertise. And I think once we appreciate that there's more ability playing a role here than there is AR in explaining the success of the cardiologist, analogies like the kind Sandel suggests, where we should give the credit to the pharmacist or to the AR designer, look less compelling. So I think that's one way we can try to reply to the cheapened achievements objection to AR enhancement, which is to suggest that there's more ability playing a role than AR in explaining the success. So it's not plausible to say the credit goes to the AR designer. The second reply I think we could suggest for the cheapened achievements worry to AR is a kind of overgeneralization reply. And that is to say that this worry will overgeneralize in the case of AR, regardless of whether it would overgeneralize in the original case of drug use. So when we think about the cardiologist case, notice that what's facilitating the cardiologist's inference is the way that the information is presented. But this is something that we already know is relevant. So we already know that presenting information in certain ways can facilitate cognitive performance, even when AR isn't in the picture. And I don't think that we generally suppose that the value of associated achievements is denigrated in any interesting sense from that difference in presentation of information outside of AR cases. So to make this less abstract, think about the Dunker candle test, for example, where you've got these participants who are given the box of tacks and a candle, and who are tested on whether they can work out how to use, how to create this kind of candle holder. And I think what we see there is that the participants find it easier to work out that you can use the tack box as a candle holder when the box is presented with the tacks out of it. So that's a difference in information presentation that I think is present in sort of everyday cases, that doesn't obviously elicit the intuition that the group who have the box separated from the tacks have a less valuable achievement. So I think there's this kind of overgeneralization worry that we might try to this cheapened achievements objection to AR as well. So those are two potential responses that we might give. But what about the designer cases then? So how about this contrasting set of cases where you have one using their imagination and pictures, and the other using the augmented reality to picture where the furniture might go? I think we can imagine somebody again like Cass or Sandel, who's worried about enhancements weakening achievements, suggesting that just using your brain-bound imagination to get this result about the furniture is more valuable than using augmented reality to help with that placement. But I think there are at least a couple of complications here that might help us diffuse that worry. And the first of those is about the role of imagination. So in both of these cases, actually, so designer A without AR and designer B with AR use imagination. So the second designer is using their imagination before they test out what the furniture will look like. So they're kind of imagining what to try out in AR and in what configuration, and then using AR to offer that visualization. So anybody who wants to suggest that there's no imagination used in the second case, so it's this sort of binary thing between a no imagination case and an imagination case, I think is getting this situation wrong. So that's one complication, that really imagination actually does play a role, I think, in both cases. And the second complication, which I think is maybe a bit more compelling, is that even if we focus in on evaluations based on effort, it's maybe a bit too quick to say that the second case, the AR case, is a lot easier than the first case. And so here what I'm thinking of is that the person using AR when they're doing their interior design has potentially hundreds of different pieces of furniture they can try out anywhere. And with AR, I think it's plausible you might feel more of a responsibility to sort of rotate through more options and in turn exert more effort in manipulating the possible option space. So the person relying on imagination might, in contrast, feel licensed to just sort of visualize something and then go with what they've imagined, so long as it works. So I think there might be a sort of increased sense that you need to try out more options and exert more effort in the AR case. And so what you might get, at least on one reading, is this interpretation where the designer who's using AR is actually putting more thought into the outcome that they're getting than the designer who's just using their imagination on its own. So two sort of potential replies then to the cheapened achievements objection in the designer case. The first being to point out that it's not just as simple as imagination and lack thereof, and the second to point out that there's at least one reading on which there is more effort exerted in the AR case rather than less. So this would I think run counter to the sort of intuitions that Cass and Sandel would have. So to kind of sum that up, what I've suggested is that regardless of whether we think the cheapened achievements worry is a serious problem for drug use, it's not obvious that the versions of these arguments that we get with respect to AR are compelling. Although again, you might think about this differently, and I've just started sort of playing with this, so I'm interested in what you think about it. But to wrap things up then, let's think about the authenticity objection and whether that does a better job when we recast it to the AR case. Firstly, I think it's not easy to get the worry off the ground with the view we were calling the existentialist view. So again, to recap, that's this view on which making authentic choices is about making choices that align with our critically endorsed values. If you are attracted to that sort of view, it seems like using AR can be entirely authentic as long as you reflectively identify as accepting or embracing whatever kind of cognitive assistance you're getting from AR. So the existentialist view, I think, doesn't straightforwardly admit of an authenticity worry for AR. The harder case is to import the essentialist sort of a view that you have as your true self, this kind of set of core traits that you can discover or sort of excavate over time. So that view, as we saw in the drug-based case, is a more compelling route into criticizing cognitive enhancement. And I think the same is true for AR here as it is for drugs, that this is the more kind of worrying interpretation. So the thought here would go something like this, that if you are relying on AR to accomplish certain successes, so whether you're the cardiologist in the first case or the designer in the second case, you're acting or behaving inauthentically because you're thinking in ways that differ from the ways that you'd be thinking if you just relied on these core characteristics that the essentialist thinks are importantly central to your true self. So an objection that takes this essentialist view would tell us that a more authentic version of you would be the one who thinks through problems in surgery or in design or in whatever by using just your unembellished visual field. And so what you get then is this manifestation of your core capacities to connect information, for example, if you're not using any kind of AR to assist in your thinking. So that's sort of how the worry would about authenticity would go through this essentialist lens about AR. And again, I think there are a couple of replies we can give here. So the first is to say that even if we endorse this essentialist view, which is contentious for all sorts of reasons, I still don't think it's obvious that we should accept this inauthenticity as a result of reasoning by being aided with AR. And the reasoning that I'm going with here is that arguably we've got as human beings this kind of disposition to use tools to achieve our goals. So that I think is something that runs as part of our being human beings as opposed to running contrary to it. And we don't need to go with some strong version of this like the Clark natural born cyborgs view, just a basic view that using tools and using our environment to try to achieve the things we want to is in line with the kind of things that we are. That's the sort of the basic idea here about tool use. And if we grant that point that using tools is sort of part of being human, then it doesn't look that obvious why someone would think that the cardiologist, say, using the AR overlay is any more inauthentic than a person who uses a reading light in low lighting, for example, or uses a fire to cook food, or whatever other sort of tool that you might imagine. And it's on the bioconservative thinker like Cass or Sandel to tell us why we should think that it's more inauthentic to use AR as a tool than it is to use these other tools that we tend to think of as part of being human beings. And the second sort of reply I might want to suggest is that even if we were to grant, again, this essentialist view and also grant that some tool use is inauthentic, I still think it's not entirely clear that AR use should be an instance of the tool use that's inauthentic. So here, if we make a distinction between two different types of technology use, that can help to bring out, I think, a little bit better what I mean here. So the first case we might imagine is somebody using a very sophisticated sort of futuristic brain-computer interface that might just feed you information through thought commands. And then the second case is our cardiologist using augmented reality as part of their heart valve surgery. I think when we look at case one versus case two, it seems like in case one, what we've got is thinking that's really entirely or almost entirely outsourced to the stipulated brain-computer interface. But the AR case is one where the person's thinking relies at least in part on their abilities, specifically on their internal capacities for making inferences. And these are the kinds of things that you'd think an essentialist would recognize as authentic. So what I'm suggesting is that even if we think that some cases of tool use are worrying for authenticity, we might still think that even by the essentialist's own picture, AR won't be the kind of problematic tool use that would contribute to inauthenticity, even if there are other kinds of technological enhancements like radical brain-computer interfaces that might contribute to inauthenticity. Okay, so what I've tried to do then is to give you a very kind of brief tour of two worries that are raised in the philosophy of human enhancement against drug use as a form of cognitive enhancement. And that's almost always where these arguments play out in the realms of thinking about pharmacology. I've tried to import them over to thinking about AR and to consider two versions of those worries that target AR rather than drug use. And I think that regardless of whether we think the drug-based worries are serious, what we've seen is that there are ways to reply to these arguments when they're recast to AR cases rather than drug cases. And just to close then, I want to say briefly what I think the wider implications of that result might be. Firstly, I think that what is suggested by looking at these arguments is that maybe AR as a form of cognitive enhancement might offer us a sort of sweet spot when it comes to these battles between bioconservative and bioliberal folks. Because it seems like AR might be a way to boost our cognition and enhance our cognition by improving our epistemic position, for example, in a way that's less objectionable by the likes of these bioconservative thinkers who tend to object to drug-based cognitive enhancement. So it might be that AR is the kind of enhancement that there can be a wider sort of agreement on in bioethics literature with respect to some of these worries. And I think what a promising area for future research here might be is to think about how AR fares with respect to other worries about human enhancement. So I mentioned there's all kinds of concerns about things like inequality, human nature, although I've said a bit about that today, agency and so on. And so I think a good sort of future project would be to think through these further arguments against drug-based enhancement and look to see whether AR fares better with respect to those in the way that I think it does regarding cheapened achievements and authenticity. And that's about all I have. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Emma. What a rich paper and what an amazing range of cases for us to think about. How fantastic. Thank you so much. Do people have questions? Oh, Neil's up first.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emma. I wondered about whether or not the achievement concern changes with a different type of case, where I think with a cardiologist, we're very outcome oriented, right? We care a lot about that it yields a good outcome, and we don't care that much about how much pat in the back somebody's getting. But if we try and morally charge it, and I've struggled a wee bit to find ones of these for whatever reason, thinking of AR cases. But if you think about, for example, suppose I'm really bad at just taking stuff that belongs to other people. I just do it all the time. And there are maybe two scenarios, one where I load the app myself and another where it's loaded unbeknownst to me, that sort of blanks out other people's stuff or does something such that I'm nudged away from nicking other people's stuff. Well, then it doesn't look like I've improved morally as a person as a result, and that might be the thing that we're worried about. And we might think it's the AR system that's doing something, or whoever installed the app, or wherever you want to find the credit on the path. And that looks like a different scenario, because I think in the cardiologist case, I just care that like did a better job on the heart. Thanks very much. Where if we're trying to assess the moral, consideration, then then it looks like it shifts, and I start to care about the achievement thing. Do you think there is a difference in those two types of achievement that's important?
I think what this suggests is that there might be an interesting difference between AR as a purely cognitive enhancement and AR as a moral enhancement. So that's like a distinction that is often made in this literature. And I think what it might suggest then is that in the moral case there's a serious worry, whereas in the cognitive case there maybe isn't. And then I think there's a lot of concern in the moral enhancement literature that anything that makes it sort of more likely that we behave better, that's sort of outside of our agency or our faculties, in some way reduces the value of our action. So John Harris talks about this in terms of freedom to fall, and he thinks that without that freedom to fall, the moral actions that we successfully pursue are not valuable in the same way that they might otherwise be. So basically, I think I agree with you, and that I think I restricted kind of the scope today to just thinking about it in terms of cognitive enhancement, but that there's I think if bioconservatives want to come back and suggest that AR poses a serious worry, they should probably use moral cases like the one you suggested. So yeah, I think there is a serious worry there.
Okay, cool, thank you.
David.
Yeah, in the same spirit as Neil, offering a different range of thinking about different ranges of cases, like the cardiologist and the designer are cool cases. But I thought if you're looking for cheapened cognitive achievements, out of one range of cases like sports or games, you're a chess player and now you use AR and you've got a chess computer that always feeds you the best move, then I definitely have a sense of cheapened achievement there. Or I don't know, I play Wordle, but some people do Wordle with with access to the word list. If your AR is feeding you the full every word consistent with your data at a given time, then I feel like that's definite. That's definitely cheapening the achievement. Or another case is moving away from sports or games. I was thinking about someone for whom like cognitive stuff really matters in their work, and maybe one case here is like the London taxi driver, who I gather in the past there was this thing like the knowledge. I don't know if it still exists, where you have to know all the streets of London. I presume these days everyone does it on their smartphone. But let's just skip the smartphone and go straight to AR. And you no longer need to biologically remember all these streets, because the moment anyone mentions a street, you'll get all the navigation there instantly. And I can imagine that being really cheapened cognitive achievement for the taxi driver, who's very proud of having the knowledge. This is a very important part of their role, and now the AR is doing that for them. Isn't it potentially cheapening something?
Yeah, your comment and Neil's comment has made me think it's very important to differentiate between process and outcome. So if what we care about is merely the outcome, like in the heart case, then it seems like there's less of a worry. Whereas if what we care about is the process, then it feels like there is a cheapened achievements worry. So it might be that me just kind of saying, there isn't a worry about cheapened achievements needs to be kind of split up in a more fine-grained way between this process and outcome distinction. I think, there's also in cheating cases in the enhancement debate, there's also discussion about whether it's just about violating a rules-based practice. So that's why I was thinking when you were mentioning the chess case, but when you use the taxi driver case, you don't get that same rules-based practice sort of potential reply. So I think, so there's probably a version of the cheapened achievements worry the bioconservative can come back with that is focused on the value of processes rather than outcomes, and the taxi driver is a good example of that, I think.
Cool, that makes sense, thanks.
Mike, I was going to ask a question that was on kind of similar lines, so just a sort of slight variant on what's been said. I was thinking about the fact that when you're in primary school, you're not allowed to use a calculator in your exams, and to use it would be cheating, because what we want to be, the very thing we're assessing is like the fact that you can do this thing. And I could never do the sums in my head. I always use my fingers, and I kind of always sometimes wondered,
Me too.
Is that cheating or what's going on with that? But obviously, as soon as you get to secondary school, Like calculators are, they're encouraged and you're taught how to use them and use them quickly and they make you better at the task. And in fact, you have to use them to pass the exam and so on. So I was thinking that there are certain activities where what we really care about is when it comes from you. So
Yeah.
like as David was saying in Wordle or chess and sport, maybe writing philosophy. I mean, like, I might really like to read some cool ideas of someone who took some amazing drugs that made them an amazing philosopher, but I kind of wouldn't like value the person who produced it in the same way. Like, yeah, who
That's
cares about that
interesting.
person? So I kind of think it's whether we're looking at I guess maybe memorizing pi is another one. Like, if I can take a tablet to memorize pi, I just it's so cheap, my achievement, even though it's kind of cool, like I can say all the numbers in the right order. But someone who can do that because they've memorized it without drugs, like I kind of value that person for that thing. So
Yeah, and do you think there's more going on here than just the distinction between valuing a process versus valuing an outcome?
I think it's the very thing like, so what I value is that a person can produce amazing works of philosophy. I could value just the philosophy, but I really value when a person can produce that. When the person can produce that on drugs, nah.
Yeah, so the distinction we were talking about before was process versus outcome, and now you're thinking about valuing the person versus valuing the product.
Or maybe there's just different tasks. So what I would value is someone's being able to memorize pi without drug enhancement. What I wouldn't value is someone's being able to memorize pi with drug enhancement.
Yeah, and that makes me think as well about whether, and I'm just thinking about this on the fly, whether there's actually some interesting connection between the two worries that I presented as distinct, which is something about your authentic self and valuable achievements, and whether there's some kind of intuition about what constitutes your authentic self or something like that that's at play in you assessing the achievement. And I haven't actually seen those two worries connected much in the literature, so it feels like maybe there's an opening there to blend them.
Yeah, I was thinking about Neil's case where, he was saying about the doctor, like, you just want any doctor, like, I don't care what drugs the doctor's on, and I don't care as long as they can fix my heart, right? And I want the very best person who can fix the heart. But suppose there was a Sherlock Holmes of doctors who could, he didn't need to use the fancier technology. He just kind of had the smarts somehow. He just worked it out in his head amazingly. Well, I actually don't care which doctor I get, but who do I admire the most? Maybe. Then.
Yeah, I think what the three comments that you all made actually suggest to me is that if a bioconservative wants to make a stronger case for the cheapened achievements worry, they should focus on particular kinds of performances. So the generality with which somebody like Cass expresses this worry lets in the kind of counterexamples I tried to suggest. Whereas if they narrow it down to specific performances, then somebody who's maybe on the pro enhancement side, like I tend to be, would have a harder time getting in against that, I think. That's really helpful. Thank you, Fiona.
Do we have any other questions for Emma? Maybe I'll ask another question then. I suppose one thing, thinking about David's case that he talked about with the knowledge. So I believe,
the taxi driver.
Yeah, I believe London taxi drivers do still have to take the test and have the knowledge. And I suppose one advantage of them doing that would, is like when the technology breaks down, how many trips have you started out on going, oh yeah, I'm just going to rely on my phone to get somewhere, and then your phone, runs out of juice or whatever and you can't get there, and you seem to be in a worse predicament than you would have been if you had not relied on the technology to begin with and you'd taken your map or whatever it was. So there are some benefits of being a generalist and not being reliant on things which may be unreliable. Just like there are lots of, you can imagine lots and lots of cases like that. When a surgeon's on the battlefield and can do certain things in battlefield conditions because they're so good, they don't have the fancy gadgets and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so this one makes me think about whether one relevant way to think about enhancements might be sort of modal assessment. So about sort of nearby possible worlds where there's a bad outcome as a result of your reliance on the enhancement or something like that. which is relevant, I think, especially to these kind of medical cases that are so often used on the pro enhancement side. You're right, the nearest world where the enhancement fails is one where you get this catastrophic worry and response. Just writing that down as well. Good. Yeah, so basically I think probably there's a better version of the cheapened achievements worry out there than is articulated by people like Cass, Sandel, Harris, etc. And that a really good defense of enhancement is going to engage with this narrower class of performances and try to argue that these achievements are still as valuable, which is a lot harder. What did you think, Fiona, about the authenticity worry about enhancement? Do you think there's a narrower class of cases there that would maybe be a problem for a pro-enhancement person too?
Not sure. I need to think a bit more about that.
That's okay.
I think Adam had a finger there on.
Oh, I was just going to say it's not a surprise if Leon Cass's argument was maybe too wide, given that he was George Bush's personal bioethicist. Something to think about that Emma pointed out. There, that's my bit.
Thanks, Adam.
I think you're from Jack.
Yeah, no. So just because Emma asked about authenticity, I mean, I was thinking when you were talking about authenticity and talking about pilots, I thought, well, why would I care if my airline pilot is authentic?
Couldn't hear that. Sorry, Jack, you broke up on my end.
I was thinking, so I was thinking when you were talking about authenticity and you mentioned airline pilots, I thought, well, why would I care if my airline pilot is authentic? I want to, like, you know, I mean, so I think the same kinds of considerations apply, right?
Yeah.
There are places where we want authenticity.
Yeah, I think usually it's the thought is that authenticity is part of some flourishing life, and so when we're not authentic, it's bad for us, versus the cheapened achievements worry, which is often focused on our assessments of other people's performances. So I think it's usually that kind of consideration about whether we're flourishing. But yeah, I see the point that there are certain cases, at least with respect to other people, where we don't care about authenticity, and other cases where it might be very important, like when it's your partner or something like that.
And maybe they shouldn't either. I'd be angry at my airline pilot if they were to choose authenticity over my safety.
Yeah, they're definitely. That's, I think, why I tried to sneak in that all things equal consideration in a lot of these discussions, because there are a lot of cases where either the cheapened achievements worry or the authenticity worry would be pretty far down the list of things we would care about in a lot of these practical contexts, I think.
Mind you, if you give your partner a pill to take, that make them a lot nicer to you. Sorry, Carol, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the paper. I guess I just had a question about what claim we want to take the AOR proponent to be defending. So kind of the way you've kind of presented it, they seem to be defending the claim that kind of the achievements are exactly as valuable. And I would have thought that an AOR proponent would go a completely different direction and say, I don't really care about comparing these achievements in terms of their value. What's interesting to me is we can now have these other achievements, right? There are now things that are open to us that previously weren't open to us. And those things might be at a kind of similar gap. And I think he kind of like suggested this in the thought that the designer might do something else, right? Or kind of like add some other facet to kind of what they're bringing to the table that would create or kind of result in the same amount of effort. And it seems like if the AOR proponent goes that direction, then this becomes not a serious worry. This becomes a very minor worry, because they can still have achievement in general. And what they're interested in are different achievements.
Yeah, so instead of comparing like with like achievement X with achievement X plus AR, say, never mind these two, think about how this one over here opens the door to these extra achievements. So this person has like a larger group of valuable achievements, some of which were maybe inaccessible to them in the former case. That might actually work as a better defense or as an additional one. But yeah, there's no particular obvious reason why we need to compare X with X rather than the case you mentioned. Good.
Steve, were you wanting to say something? No, sorry, I mistook that. Was there anyone else that have I missed anyone, or that I can see someone in the chat here? Oh, Andre, do you want to speak to what you said in the chat? Oh, was a comment? There's a
Oh.
recent paper on tech-induced cognitive enhancement.
Oh, interesting. That's great. Thank you. I haven't seen this. Most of the literature focuses on drug use to the exclusion of AR or brain computer interfaces or other stuff. So this looks really exciting, actually. Thank you very much for sending that.
Sure, there's the neuromedia thought experiment, which is very, very nice. And I think it actually parallels like the issues discussed today on AR. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot. This looks great.
Great. Well, let's thank Emma very much for such a stimulating and exciting paper to